Welcome to Rich Planet TV. I'm Richard D. Hall. Today I am going to be talking about the work of Nigel Kerner. Now, Nigel authored his first book in 1997 entitled The Song of the Greys. He wrote another book in 2010 entitled Grey Aliens and the Harvesting of Souls. Now, to discuss these books, I'm joined today by two of Nigel's researchers, Danielle Silverman. Welcome, Danielle.
Thank you.
And Professor John Biggerstaff. Welcome, John.
Hello, Richard.
Now then, I'm just going to set the context for the discussion that we're going to have. I'm going to read from the back cover of Nigel's second book. In 1997, Nigel Kerner first introduced the notion of aliens known as Greys coming to Earth, explaining that Greys are sophisticated biological robots created by an extraterrestrial civilization they have long since outlived. In this new book, Kerner reveals that the Greys are seeking to master death by obtaining something humans possess that they do not: souls. Through the manipulation of human DNA, these aliens hope to create their own souls and thereby escape the entropic grip of the material universe in favor of the timeless realm of spirit. Okay, I mean, this is a very deep subject, and we're probably just going to scratch the surface of that today. But before we get into the detail, and I will pose some devil's advocate type questions about this, because there are a lot of people who would say, grey aliens, what a load of rubbish, we don't believe that they exist, and we will go into that. But first, Danielle, what's your background, and how did you get first involved with Nigel Kerner?
Well, I met him maybe about 25 years ago. I was maybe about 18 then. And I was always very interested in things that related to something beyond the purely mundane, everyday things that I came across in everyday life. And I knew there was something more to our existence than just the physical, just what we perceive through our physical senses. I always felt that that can't be all there is.
Right.
So I come from a Jewish background, and Judaism tends to be a very secular religion. It's mainly just cultural. It's passed on from family to family with traditions, very little explanation of anything beyond the physical. And I was always looking for a meaning that made sense to me. And I couldn't relate to the concept of a creator God that would somehow put us here and put us in a circumstance where we would suffer just to learn some kind of lesson, or to break free of that our situation of ignorance and suffer along the way to then find our way back to him. It just made no sense to me. So I was looking for some kind of answer. And my brother Andrew, he'd met Nigel, and he said, "Look, I've spoken to him. He's interested in deeper philosophical ideas, and maybe you should talk to him.
Okay.
And he may be able to answer some of your questions." So Andrew introduced me to Nigel, and at that stage he was writing a book that's actually not come out yet, strangely. He wasn't yet researching the grey aliens. He was writing on more philosophical and
his work does touch on philosophical and why are we here, and is there a God, and all of that sort of stuff, which we'll get into. But John, just tell us about your background.
Well, I've known Nigel since we became friends nearly 40 years ago, and I went off to do science and became a cell biologist. And during my first degree, I came across some interesting anomalies in biological science that I wanted to be able to answer, and I came to discuss some of these with Nigel over time. And really then we got into discussions over many, many years, and Nigel was putting his ideas forwards about really looking more specifically beyond the textbook at really the process of biology and how it really worked. And from that, I've always been interested in really trying to back up what Nigel's been saying by looking into science and see what sort of evidence there was for it. And in the course of these two books, and now a third, I think there is a huge amount of evidence, and I'm pretty convinced about these ideas.
Right. So you are a professor of cell biology, is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Nigel does seek to align his theory with scientific knowledge. Would you say he's not?
Indeed. I mean, everything he and I and others discuss. I mean, we try to back up and say, is there evidence for this type of idea? So it's not really sort of a you know, one of these sort of new age ideas where we come up with a concept without any backup for it.
Okay, now on my show, as viewers will know, I've covered a lot of information about UFOs and alleged alien visitation or people who claim to have been abducted. And many of those researchers that I've interviewed, very few of them, or none of them in fact, have a real, put forward an overall complete hypothesis as to why they're here, what their program is, why did they seem to come and go out of our atmosphere, and why do they seem to take people, if that's indeed what they are doing, and what are they doing it for? They seem to, people say it's a genetics program, but Nigel actually puts forward something on the table and says, that's why they're here, this is what they're doing. And he's probably one of the only people who've actually done that, stuck their neck out, shall we say, so far to be able to. Yes. So could either of you summarise his hypothesis?
Well, looking at the evidence from Professor Jacobs and Bud Hopkins' research into abduction episodes, it does seem to be the case that these grey alien beings that people encounter in the abduction episodes, they seem to have no sense of emotion, no sense of any countenance of whatever might be going on in the people they abduct. They can, all kinds of pain is suffered, they take people against their will, they don't seem to have any sense of conscience or any human sense of empathy with the people they abduct. And it's almost as though they're some kind of robotic entity, and that is basically Nigel's hypothesis, that that's what these grey alien beings are, that they aren't capable of an emotional sense or a sense of empathy, simply because, not because they're evil, not because they're something, they have terrible intentions, simply because they're following a program and they don't know how to be any different. So you might get there's many examples quoted in David Jacobs and Bud Hopkins' research where the grey aliens will give one of the babies to somebody to hold, one of their hybrid babies that they might have made, and they seem to be watching to see what the emotional concourse is between the woman or the man holding the child and how that affects the child. They seem to be confused. There's a look of bewilderment as to what on earth is going on. What is this strange thing called emotion?
Right. You know? And let's just touch on Jacobs for a moment, and also Bud Hopkins you mentioned. You've studied their work, yeah?
Yes.
In detail. These are people who have interviewed and regressed hundreds, if not thousands, of abduction or abductees.
Yes.
Now, what do you say to the skeptic who says, well, look, this is all research done on people who are under hypnosis, who are possibly dreaming it, making it up, etc. You know, it's not real things that have actually physically happened to them. How would you answer that question?
Well, I would say that there are just too many common factors that run throughout all these episodes, that if it was just a manufactured thing, there would be every individual is different. They would make up something, there would be lots of variations in the reports. And not only that, these are ordinary, down-to-earth people. It's not New Age people who want to read all kinds of weird and wonderful meanings into their own experiences. It's just ordinary people, housewives, policemen, even lawyers, politicians, whoever. All people from all walks of life, all coming up with a very, very similar episode with the same characteristics.
So just run us through one of those similar episodes with the broad characteristics that these researchers have uncovered.
Well, invariably people are taken against their will. Not against their will, they're not asked for permission. It happens before they even know it, that they find themselves in a context in which they're surrounded by sometimes a tall grey alien being and a small, short grey alien being, or several of the two types. And they seem to be either doing some kind of experiment on them, looking at, examining often their genitalia, sometimes removing sperm, removing ova, or they seem to be putting ideas somehow in their mind. They look at them and they seem to telepathically be transmitting some kind of message into their minds. And the whole episode really does seem to be, reminds me anyway, of some kind of experiment, like we would look at rats in a laboratory and see how they behave in certain circumstances. That's really the context it seems to be for most abductees, and very frightening too.
Yeah, I mean, that's quite a scary concept for people to think about, that in the same way that we have mastered farm animals or laboratory rats, as you said, the land, etc., we are masters of our world, the human race. Could there be another master which is actually doing the same to us? What do you think about that, John?
Absolutely. I think, given the overwhelming evidence that, as Danielle was saying, you know, and the enormous number of reputable people who've been coming up with these types of claims, coupled with what happened in the press club in America, you know, where many people from radar installations to atomic stations have been saying that they've not only seen these things, but these things have buzzed their aircraft, have changed the codes on nuclear missiles, etc. I think when you have such an amazing amount of data from reputable people, it's certainly enough to convince me as a scientist that something is really going on here that needs investigation in a big way, I think.
And the other person who investigated this in detail was Professor John Mack, who died in, I think, 2007, got knocked over.
Yes.
I mean, what can you tell us about him, and how important was he to Nigel's work?
Well, as a professor of psychiatry at Harvard, he obviously had held great weight in confirming for many people the possible authenticity of these abduction reports. And so just purely from that point of view, with his reputation, I think that was that somebody of that standing took this so seriously. That's a very important thing, and he had definitely, his research was very, very valuable in confirming and illustrating to us the nature of these abduction reports.
Right. Now, in Nigel's book, in order to kind of make the case that these aliens they're robots, they're not beings as such. That's what the case that he makes. He tries to explain the difference between a being and a machine, which it gets quite deep. You get into philosophy or the God verse, as he explains it.
Right.
Just try and explain to us how he explains the difference between a living, sentient being, something which is connected to what he calls the God verse. So just explain that for us, Danielle.
Okay. Well, if you look at the nature of our universe, we're told that it started with a Big Bang, and from that point onwards, there was momentum outwards into due to something called the second law of thermodynamics, or entropy, into states of greater and greater separation and chaos with time. And that's the momentum that our universe, all physical things, are travelling in towards greater states of chaos. Now, if you trace that back to the original point of the Big Bang, then you would logically arrive at a point of union and in fact, a point of perfect union. Now, the strange thing is that all scientists that I know of don't want to look beyond that point of the Big Bang. If you ask them, well, what happened before the Big Bang? What state was there before the Big Bang? They say they don't want to answer that question because, as scientists, it's not tangible. We can't measure it. We can only speculate. Therefore, we're not going to talk about it. We're not going to ask any questions. Now, that for Nigel is the most, as far as I understand it, the most, and for me too, the most fascinating question of all. Where did all of this come from? Where did our whole existence come from in the first place? You can talk about Higgs fields and the little things that happened after the Big Bang, and everybody seems to be so fascinated with that. But really, the real question is what caused it in the first place. Now, if there is a state of perfect union, where there's no separation of points, which is the logical state that it would be if you trace back that momentum of drift into states of greater and greater separation, then if there's no separation of points, there's no start, there's no end, there's no time, in other words. You're talking about a timeless state. You're talking about an infinite state, because there's no beginning, there's no end to it. Okay? Now, an infinite state implies that covers all possible states, including our finite universe. And it's Nigel's suggestion that that infinite state, it's the starting point for our existence in this physical universe, and the finite universe that we exist in is within that. So as an infinite state, it feels every state that we're in now, the presence of that infinite first state before the Big Bang is omniversal. Okay? Now, in that, if there is a state that's infinite, it has no limit, and therefore there's a state of perfect freedom. And what Nigel suggests is, and it's a very secular understanding of the principle of God, which many people won't be used to, but was very attractive to me because I couldn't understand this concept of a creator God, that if there's perfect freedom, then within that perfect freedom, to do absolutely anything, there has to be the freedom to no longer be perfectly free.
Right.
Okay?
I think I'm following it, John.
Yeah. So if there's the freedom to no longer be perfectly free, perhaps our universe is an expression of that freedom.
Right.
But in the complete expanse of all knowledge that infinite expression must be, there's limit within that, a possibility for limit, and perhaps we're just the result of that possibility for limit, and we've got caught in that limit.
So he draws a distinction between the physical universe and some other place, or which I think he refers to as the Godverse. Is that right?
The Godverse, that is that infinite state. He calls it the Godverse because there's so many connotations attached to the word God, and so on. So he tries to make it to give the sense that it's an implicate state that is not in any way directed. There's no creator God, no man with long flowing beard.
Yeah, because if you ask the question, God made the universe, then I just would say, well, who made God? Then people say, well, no, nobody made God. He just is. Then you could say, well, isn't the universe just is? Why does the universe need a creator if God doesn't need a creator, if you see what I'm saying? But he goes on to talk about the soul and the fact that there's basically a component of beings which does not die when the physical body dies. Reincarnation, people call it, and this is he mentions quite a few cases of near-death experiences and what's the other one? Children who claim to come out with stories from previous lives, etc. I mean, you believe in that, John?
Absolutely. I think a lot of this really stems from what Danielle said. One of the connotations of this is that this state of union of all being really is where consciousness resides. All consciousness resides in principle all together, and really because it is a state of singularity in its way, it really defines that there must therefore be its opposite, which is really a state of everything being observed from the state of separation, and therefore within those two boundaries, universes really come about, which are really a conglomerate part of these two functions. Really a function of what is really the chaotic pole, if you like, of being, which is physicality, etc. And within this framework you have this consciousness function, if you like, which is being mixed together in this sort of central phase of what we observe in our universe. And therefore consciousness itself is really a function of the universe. Right. And in such a state, it exists within, quantum physicists would talk about, for instance, potentials and actuals, collapsing wave functions. Well, the potential, therefore, for being, what we really are, is in this potential state. And we are mixed in this place with really an atomic frame to generate what we call living beings. And therefore, because the living being is really made of the atoms, the consciousness itself, being part of a continuum, is not subject to the same forces that the atoms are, and therefore when the atoms decay due to the second law of thermodynamics, which Nigel goes into in detail, it really leaves this consciousness to then progress on its way.
Right.
So,
because Nigel says that awareness and will exist outside the physical.
yes.
So there's something outside the physical things that science can detect that is playing a role in that physical world.
Yeah.
I.e.,
I mean, physical
So-
things such as atoms and that part of the universe. If we look at really the atomic state in our universe, really I liken it to really a jar full of marbles in many
Right.
ways. If we take our marbles like the atoms, really they can touch each other, but they can't really see the atoms more distant to them. So there's
Right.
some sort of locality to this. But bear in mind, in terms of this jar, we could pour water into this jar, and this water is in fact a full continuum, and yet it's still a function of this jar of marbles.
Right.
And what we're trying to liken this to is that consciousness, or soul, if you like, is where you have this potential in this entire continuum between the atoms. Therefore, it occupies the whole universe. It's
Right.
infinite in its capacity, but it's really localized in a living system, really within the atomic frame. And therefore, when that atomic frame is actually done with or succumbs to entropy, then the consciousness remains entirely intact
Right.
and away from that.
Yeah, these are quite difficult concepts to grasp. I mean, Nigel says that the soul is like a strand, as he calls it, connected to some central point. Is that right?
Well,
or-
being part of this continuum, it obviously has and the universe actually comes from a single point, then this continuum of consciousness actually comes essentially from the beginning of the
you
universe.
see, if that initial point is timeless, if we came from a state of pure awareness and perfectly free will to start with, and that state is timeless, then by definition it goes on forever. And if we from that perfect freedom made the choice to explore the nature of separation and limit with our awareness and our will, then our awareness and will would be an information field that started at that point and then traced a path all the way through our existence into a physical separated state.
Right.
And that's how Nigel would define a soul, and does define it in his books, as an information field, a line of connection back to that eternal state that pre-existed the nature of capturing a physical universe.
All right, and Danielle and John, we're going to go for a break, and we'll be talking more about Nigel Kerner's books after this. Welcome back. I'm Richard D. Hall, and I'm talking to Danielle Silverman and Professor John Biggerstaff. Now, we're discussing Nigel Kerner's book, Grey Aliens and the Harvesting of Souls, and both John and Danielle have been involved in helping Nigel with these books. Now, Nigel puts forward the case that he thinks that the grey aliens that many people report in abduction scenarios are some kind of robot. They're not really alive. Is it not possible that artificial intelligence, they could make a conscious being artificially, and it could pretend to be conscious? Is that not possible?
It could pretend to be conscious, but it wouldn't be conscious, because in order for there to be consciousness, in order for there to be awareness of an external world around you, you have to have a reference outside of that external world in order to know it. For example, we perceive the passage of time from one point to another, from past to present to future. If we were, as all physical atomic things are, purely subject to that passage of time, without any extra element, any extra ingredient that was timeless and outside of that situation, we would not be aware of it. It's just like if you're sitting in an aeroplane and you look out of the window, the only reason you can see the movement because you have a reference. You feel like you're still, even though you're moving, because you have a reference. You have two references there. You need a reference outside of the passage of time, outside of point to point to point to point, to be able to be aware and to know that passage of time, to be aware, to be conscious. And therefore something that's artificial, something that's created purely out of atoms and a physical set of ingredients, cannot be aware. It's just a program. A computer, just no different to a very highly advanced computer, an artificial intelligent robot. There's no way it can be aware of its programs. It can just run on them.
Let's come on to the argument of evolution versus intelligent design versus intervention, because you're a cell biologist, John, but you don't believe in evolution. Is that right?
That's absolutely true, and it's present and in a neo-Darwinist way.
Right. So
I think there's much more to the story than that actually lends part of a lie to that. Although, for instance, Darwin himself was absolutely accurate in that species will adapt to their environment. And really, he didn't claim in that sense that there's really an ascendancy of order. He was just saying they adapt to their environment, and this may be the way in which species come about. But the problem is that in the light of really the physics and cosmology of the thing, we've just been talking about the beginning of the universe, and it was important to do so because from the beginning of the universe, everything is tending towards more and more separate states, such that eventually it's predicted that, you know, there will be what's called the heat death of the universe, in which everything really just stops, and the whole universe effectively comes to an end. Well, in this decay process, so entropy, really, or rather the second law of thermodynamics, is really driving everything to become more and more and more separate. And what neo-Darwinian evolution has proposed is that on this Earth, some molecules in various puddles somewhere many years ago with little bits of lightning, etc., can really come together, form complex systems in which they can then become self-replicative and actually eventually get to the point where they become more and more and more sophisticated and eventually generate human beings, etc.
Okay, so how did the human being come about if it didn't gradually evolve from something much simpler in small steps?
Absolutely, I'm coming to that.
How did we get to be?
Exactly. Well, if we go back to where we were, and consciousness is a function of the universe, which is, you know, it's sort of ignored and sidelined by science, and this is really why I think most of the sciences can't make any sense of either the universe or living systems, is that this consciousness, this soul part, this observer, if you like, in physics, is really required for the universe to be. Now, the point is that because consciousness is really a function of the universe, as the second law of thermodynamics is breaking everything up, so basically everything rots. Well, if one's soul, essentially, one's being, one's awareness, is really linked into this field, then it too will gradually break up into smaller and smaller components. And therefore, the whole thing is really consistent at that point because it's with the second law of thermodynamics. Whereas the theory of evolution, neo-Darwinist evolution, is really going against the second law of thermodynamics. It's saying this is a special case. They claim actually that the sun can do this, but in that case, why isn't it doing it to everything? You know, how does it just do it to some molecules? And really, the evolutionary biologists have really, in the last few years, really come to almost give up that idea in favour of what Fred Hoyle and Chandra Wickrama Singh were saying years ago about, you know, life coming in on asteroids. Problem with that, though, is that we're really just deferring the problem. Life on this planet may have come from asteroids.
Yeah.
Where did that life come
Another
from?
group called the intelligent design people
Yeah.
actually say, okay, well, to overcome this problem of this assembly of everything, you know, against a trend towards randomness, which can't really happen, the intelligent design people actually say, okay, well, there's a problem with this, but so we have to put in information right at the beginning to actually generate this whole thing. This thing is still not consistent with the second law of thermodynamics, and so really this concept of devolution, if you like, where you're getting the simultaneous breakup of all living things through more ephemeral states of being into more solid states of being, is actually a much more consistent model.
Okay, now if we just look at the Earth, okay, there's a section from this book that I've been reading called Genetics for Dummies. I'm just going to read this part out of it.
I think I'd need to read that.
Scientists have compared mtDNA from people all over the world to investigate the origins of modern humans. These comparisons have led some scientists to believe that all modern humans have one particular female ancestor in common, a woman who lived on the African continent about 200,000 years ago. Now that's fairly accepted, is it, John?
It's generally fairly accepted,
And
yes.
now you get your
Your
anthropologists who will say, well, that African Eve was an offshoot from some other hominid or some other ancestor. Whereas you get other people, I've spoken to Lloyd Pye, who believes there was an actual genetic intervention, who said that that first Eve was actually part, at least in part, genetically engineered, the result of a genetic engineering from some advanced race.
Really, if we look at mutations in mitochondrial DNA through the ages, you can actually backtrack this to a theoretical single individual around a couple of 100,000 years ago. And this really points to the fact that there was a real bottleneck in the number of hominids around at that time. And really what Nigel is saying in the book is really that this process of devolution, you know, you're actually going to go down until you're gradually losing awareness as time goes on, and so you become the equivalent of a human being, you become a hominid, you know, you become less able, more reductionist, and then that will go down through animal species.
Okay, so how does the complex, all-seeing, all-intelligent human being come about in the first place then, all that complexity? If you're saying that it devolves rather than evolves.
Well, it devolved at one point, but then this is where these artificial intelligence systems come in, because they actually come in, and because we have a memory in our DNA, which is really our junk DNA, they can actually then, these guys come along and they can trace this, and therefore they can sort of reboot the whole system. And this is what I think a lot of people, including Nigel, are really suggesting, is that, you know, you can then start to increase brain size, and then you increase, because one of the big problems with the concept of evolution, for instance, is the number of things that happened at the same time. And within 200,000 years, by random chance, really there's no possible way that this can really happen. And so there had to be some sort of intervention. And really, the Greys or this system is really the candidates for doing this. And really the next question is, why would you do such a thing?
Because the brain size in modern humans is, you know, they can't really explain well how that came about. The sudden increase in brain size. Just tell us about that.
Nowadays we're actually saying, okay, well, we're only using a certain part of our brain. Some people would say we're only using about 5% of it, but others would say it's more than that. But nevertheless, there is a significant part of our brain which is not currently being used. And therefore, you know, people say, okay, well, again, according to evolutionary theory, this is clearly impossible, because otherwise you're actually making redundant systems. You're actually saying, okay, well, just in case, I'm going to make this thing twice as big. That therefore points to something intending to do that. So these things cannot happen randomly. The next thing that happens is that if you're going to increase the size of the brain and actually increase technological knowledge, etc., then your problem is, how are you going to have the babies with these increased sized brains? So you've got to do something else to the body to actually admit the larger baby's brain, head through into the world, and therefore you've got to make changes in that. And so there are a whole bunch of commensurate changes which had to occur, and there's no possible way that those are going to occur accidentally.
Right, okay. Nigel contends that the whole abduction phenomenon is about those Greys trying to get something that we possess that they don't. What are they trying to get?
First of all, I think we have to talk about the origin of how perhaps these grey aliens came to be, Nigel's thesis for how he suggests they came to be in the first place. And the best way, I think, to explain that, and as he does explain it in his books and in his the articles he writes, he just take one look at our own technology and how over just the past 20, 30 years there's been exponential increases in technology, moves towards artificial intelligence and cybernetics, moving us towards gradually a state of being where many aspects of our lives are augmented by some kind of technological feature. They're talking about putting chips into people to deliver drugs, chips to enhance memory, and all kinds of various technologies that previously we used to do very well without, but now are totally indispensable to us. Now, people like Michio Kaku and Stephen Hawking, and of course Ray Kurzweil, they think this future is this technological future that we're heading for, which some people call transhumanism, is absolutely wonderful, because we're heading towards a kind of physical immortality where we can, just using technology, go on forever. Okay, and we can, in fact, there's a company called LifeNaut in America, which is now doing an experiment, getting people to download into a computer all their ideas, all their daily actions. They put everything in there, their likes, their dislikes, with the hope of having a bank of information that they can one day put into some kind of robotic, artificially intelligent being, which will be them.
Right.
I think it was 2004. BT were inventing something called the soul catcher, and that's they were inventing this. It was a chip that would be connected somehow to the optic nerve and would take in all the information, all the sensory information around an individual throughout their life, implanted at birth, and that again could be put into some kind of artificially intelligent robot which could replicate them and be them in the future.
But you would argue that it never ever could be them, because
never
it's
could
not,
be them. Of course,
something...
it can't be conscious.
Right.
In fact, whoever did it wouldn't be there to appreciate it.
Right.
Now, what Nigel's saying is that perhaps, and in fact it's more than likely, because anybody looking at the trillions of planets out there would know there's got to be other life out there. It's not just us. And other life which would have very likely progressed beyond our technological stage, way past what we're doing now, into a stage of creating the height of artificial intelligence. And maybe they would do what Stephen Hawking is actually suggesting, that we, after we finished on our planet and we've used its resources, there's all kinds of problems here, go out into space, take a genetic trace of what we are, set up colonies out there. Or maybe they've done exactly the same thing. They've sent out artificially intelligent entities out into space to find, with their genetic codes, a trace of them, just as this LifeNaut company are trying to do, but much more advanced, just as the Soul Catcher is trying to do, but much more advanced, to find somewhere where they can replicate and exist.
So in other words, the more advanced civilizations would be sending out more sophisticated versions of Beagle 2, for example.
Yes.
Or the Mars Lander or whatever.
Yes, exactly.
And it's not going to have wheels and an engine on it. It's going to be a being that they're going to send out to, rather than send themselves out because they're too important, they don't want to get damaged or whatever, so they send out something that can repair itself.
I mean, they wouldn't survive this travel necessary through space.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Part of
but it's still biological in its function, you think? I mean,
pseudo-biological. It's been programmed with what its creators would do. Now, Richard, one of the things that it's going to be programmed with is to look after itself. You don't want this thing sort of falling off a cliff, or neither do you want other entities coming at it and destroying it. And so you're going to put into its programming this ability really to look after itself. And, you know, in looking around, it's going to look at its creators really as really the biggest threat to what's going to be able to take them out. And therefore, you know, one idea is that, okay, well, then they will go and take their creators out. But rather than do that, you know, in order to understand what the creator is really able to do in destroying them, really I think, and Nigel think, this is Nigel's thesis, really that they're going to come along and try and integrate with their creators to actually find out what's going on, so that they can actually take on those qualities they can't understand that they observe in the creator. And really this is the thesis of really what these beings might be doing here on Earth, reconstructing hominids, you know, that have devolved a bit far to.
So the Greys are like a renegade group of extremely advanced space probes or space research project to try and find out about the universe, and then somehow they've become separated from their masters. Now,
yes,
if you were going to design,
we are
designing
like
that,
those things at the moment.
Yeah, you would have an override switch on the whole thing. Would they not have thought of that, do you think?
Well,
and that's a devil's advocate question.
Imagine, for instance, they come from another planet. And they've actually maybe then, you know, before they ever learn any of this, they've been sent out into space. They have no further access to their creators. They've got autonomous programs.
Right.
Because
Go on.
they've got no access to being switched off, because they are now so far away from where they were created. They were running on an autonomous program to actually go and find out, investigate, and really, you know, perceiving beings like us that can, you know, they can actually read electromagnetic potentials from living things and all of this. And some of these are highly coded in terms of our bodies and our beings. And over time, they can actually sort of spot this trend of birth and rebirth which they are not able to actually do. And they can see advantages in this in terms of potentially overcoming entropy, etc. And therefore they're trying to merge with this at the moment.
But there is a problem why you can't actually, I mean, even if they had tried to put an override switch in there and say, right, don't destroy or don't do anything harmful to something like us, the creator being that created them, and they put everything about the creator, every piece of information about that creator into the artificially intelligent entity that they've sent out into space, and program that entity, don't do anything negative, don't harm anything like us because you're supposed to be protecting us. There's a problem there because there's something that you can't program into an artificially intelligent being, or you can't program at all because it's not physical. It's something that's of a nature that cannot be written down in an atomic format. And it's Nigel's thesis that ingredient that I'm talking about is a soul, and that information field that comes from beyond the physical universe, comes from before the state of physicality existed. That infinitely present information field cannot be written into the program. So if they come across beings that have that information field that doesn't have a physical quantum to it, they might see it as a threat because they can't. It's not in their information field. They can't cope with it, and they don't know not to harm that.
Right.
All they see it as is something that they don't know, they don't understand, and because they're ultimately the ultimate in artificial intelligence, they want to understand it. They want to conquer it. They want to further the program that's been put in them to extend the life of the information that's been given to them, their program, and therefore they try and work that in to us, to those the entities
so there's
that are
nothing
here.
malicious about this on they're just following a program.
Right.
They don't realize about what the consciousness really exists or anything. They just see this program running, they think it's a program running in us that's better than that.
All right, we're going to go for another quick break, and after the break we're going to discuss some of the things which Nigel suggests that these greys have been doing over the last 10 to 20,000 years. Welcome back. I'm Richard D. Hall, and I'm talking to Danielle Silverman and Professor John Biggerstaff about Nigel Kerner's work, Grey Aliens and the Harvesting of Souls. Now, one of the very disturbing things that Nigel suggests in his book is that grey aliens for millennia have been tinkering with human genetics, and that the broad races on Earth have been messed with in a particular way. Some people would read this and say that is very racist, but he actually suggests that racism is something which has been introduced by them. Is it?
That's right, to create separate control groups, just as any scientific experimenter would, so you can watch safely within that, without any interfering factors, what's going on in that biological group. So racism is a perfect way to keep a group genetically pure, so that they can look at what's going on with their experiments. But John can perhaps explain
So if I'm doing an experiment, for instance, with organisms, bacteria, and I want to do something, make a genetic change in them or whatever, very often we'll put in something called a reporter gene, which will then express and change the colour of the growth of the colonies, etc., within this plate. Having seen a difference, which is to the experimenter's advantage, this is actually what I want to achieve because I can then perform my actions on that. I will then take that colony, for instance, and then split it up into different plates and take the other colonies as controls and then move them to different plates. Now, if we go back really to the out of Africa idea, partly the fact that, the whether it was a lush environment they were in, there wasn't really much incentive for people to go walking thousands of miles to do things. It's more likely, given this scenario and what Nigel hypothesizes, is that really in the same way that I mess with organisms on plates, that these guys were messing with us as a species, really looking for advantageous genetics. Not so much racism, as we said, these things are running according to a program. They only care about whether they can mess with our genes more efficiently. And it turns out that the molecule melanin, actually, you know, when we mess with genetics and stuff, one of the ways in which we can do it is to use things like ultraviolet light to actually splice the genes in the cells and actually alter the genetics, or to get things to, you know, things we've put in to actually take, so that we can almost microsurgically implant them in the cells. The thing is, if these cells have got a lot of melanin in them, it's a dark pigment, it tends to absorb that light and diffract it and turn it into vibrations, etc. And then the light just doesn't get where it's really supposed to go. And so really, in the discovery, perhaps even accidental, discovery of subspecies of us, if you like, or groups of us, which didn't express so much melanin, made it easier for them to get their genetic profiles into us. And therefore they then sort of sent the white people, if you like, or one group further north. You know, some became the Aboriginals of Australia, some were left in Africa. And so there was this great movement of these different populations, and really then they concentrated on the ones which they had most access to.
Because
so it's not racism in a way.
Yeah, as I said, it's accepted that every person on the planet is basically directly descended from pretty much one Eve in Africa. Now, let's say that was a result, all of the variation that's currently on Earth,
Yes.
that was a result of intervention by the Greys, say,
Yes.
right? Would geneticists not have spotted that in the human genome? Would they not by now have gone, hey, look, this group have been messed with because that genetic change couldn't have happened so quickly? Would they not have spotted it?
A lot of geneticists think things happen randomly, but random changes can then add up, etc. In fact, a lot of statistics says random variation, etc., is nearly impossible. And in fact, this has led the genetics crowd really into some really big problems trying to explain things like this. And so what they'll do is, yes, quite rightly, the mitochondrial DNA has fluctuated, and you can backtrack that fluctuation. But what else has happened in terms of other interventions to do with both the DNA and with the things that control what DNA does can actually happen an awful lot faster if deliberately put in there.
Right.
But there is a special, do you want to explain the special about melanin and how it protects the cell, the DNA inside the nucleus? That's very important.
Part of the reason you can't do these experiments, where there's a lot of melanin around, the melanin actually in a lot of people, in black people, it's actually spread out through the skin. It spreads out through the cells and covers everything. But even in a lot of white people, the melanin actually will coat the nucleus of the cell. And therefore the DNA, your central DNA, even in white people, can be actually well protected from the actions of the ultraviolet light.
But there's no doubt in people with higher melanin, natural higher melanin, that it's far more likely that melanin will be coating the nucleus, the cell wall of the nucleus of the DNA. Now the point about that is that ultraviolet light, which is often used to splice DNA, is blocked by that melanin. It absorbs it. It doesn't allow it in to interfere with the DNA. And it could well be, and this is Nigel's thesis, that this was a blocker for them when they were trying to genetically alter the species. And therefore, when maybe just out of random mutation, something like an albino came along, they discovered, wow, we can get straight in.
Right.
And it may well be that the paler-skinned nation, people on the earth, have that pale skin because of this genetic experimentation to make things easier for them to work on human DNA. And in fact, Professor Steve Jones argues that this thing about vitamin D being, pale skin being there to allow vitamin D to be absorbed and so on, all these theories about why pale skin happened in the first place, he believes it's not an adequate explanation. There is no real explanation or justification for the need for pale skin at all.
Yeah, because I think if
dark skin is always an advantage in every circumstance.
As most people would just automatically assume, well, they went to live in the north where there's less sun, so therefore their skin changed colour. But that's not the case.
According to Professor Steve Jones, an eminent professor of biology, that is absolute nonsense.
Right. Okay.
There's just no reason at all for pale skin.
You would want to absorb more light. And why did we lose hair if we came to a colder climate, etc. So obviously, something's wrong with that idea.
Right, all right. And Nigel contends that that the white races, the northern European races, have probably had the most interference from this outside entity called the grey alien.
Yeah, and he doesn't say that. It's very important to say he doesn't say that from the point of view of a kind of reverse racism.
Right.
It's just he's letting us know that, right, that's there, you may need to do something about it,
right.
and maybe suggesting ways that we could do something about it. And if you
yeah.
look at the record of the European nations throughout history, in terms of colonialism, imperialism, and what they've, the havoc they've wreaked on the world, it makes the point
that
really.
It's the blue-eyed white races that have got
Yeah.
their finger on the nuclear. Well, I mean, what about China? Because he mentions the Chinese as well, doesn't he? He says that they've had significant intervention. Is that, am I right there?
That's right.
It's the black people who haven't. Is that?
Not that they haven't. There's been interception all across the board. They found ways of doing it, but the most efficient way to do it is on cell nucleuses that aren't protected by the melanin shield.
Okay. Right.
That's just the most efficient, easiest way to do it.
Now let's come on to the final part of the thesis. Then they're making these changes because they're continually trying to somehow attach themselves to us so that they can piggyback onto our souls. Have I read that right?
That's right.
So
which is impossible to do.
Right.
From their perspective and their programming, it's not realised that that's the case.
Right.
Yeah, that's the difference between the theme that runs throughout Nigel's books. The difference between what's natural and what's synthetic. Mm-hmm. And what's synthetic can never really bridge into what's natural. It's not possible to recreate a pathway back from the finite into the infinite, from our physical universe into the state beyond. You can't do that make a bridge out of atoms. It's just absolutely impossible. But as artificially created beings, they can't know that because they don't know, they have no reference.
Right.
So they're looking for something that can allow them to somehow recreate their original creator beings in the best possible context that will allow them to survive physically as long as possible. But there's a problem, this second law of thermodynamics that's constantly breaking things down,
right.
Okay, all physical things. And they notice that there's something about human beings, about all living things, this natural living things, that has this information field that seems to return. And Nigel speaks about reincarnation in his books as the mechanism through which this happens, as an information field never ends. This information field from an eternal state can never end. It comes back, reincarnates. That they somehow detect this, and they're looking for that revitalizing factor somehow that will give their program from their original creator beings the chance to survive forever, like we do. Right. As eternal souls.
And just to touch on that, Nigel says in his book that the Eastern religions talk about reincarnation. The West, people think they don't talk about reincarnation, but he says that this is not necessarily the case. All religions at some point in time believe in the migration of the soul.
That's right. All the mystical sides of all the main world religions, Kabbalah, Gnosticism, Sufism, all the main religions, their mystical sides, which pre-existed their more conventional mainstream sides now, believed in reincarnation. And in fact, the Christian church believed in it until this very strange episode happened with Justinian, who was the head of the church at the time, and his wife Theodora was told by a soothsayer that in a previous life she was a witch.
Right.
She therefore convinced her husband to take out reincarnation from the Christian Codex.
Really? Right.
So it may well be that in time, we've got all of this going on with these greys trying to assimilate us. Makes the story sound really horrible, for the future of the human race, and it's quite dangerous. But it may be that in times, past, great teachers have come along. In other words, people with souls with more awareness, more closer to the beginning point than we are, have come along really to warn us that this is going on. Because really, in the end, the only way out, if you have an eternal soul, then the only way really to overcome the problem of aliens and stuff is to really remove yourself from the physical component, and actually go back to that place where everything is all together.
Which is what the great teachers of the past, the Buddha, Yeshua, the Jewish name for Jesus, or the Muhammad, all the great teachers are saying this, and that's basically the central pillar of what Nigel's saying. But
so he thinks they were warning the human race about.
Yeah, I
about
mean,
the
it says Jesus
intervention.
came to
Danger,
save
yes.
us. What's he saving us from?
Right.
You see, the transhumanists are looking for some kind of physical immortality in a state which is absolutely lunatic, because they can create all of this, and they're not going to be there to be aware or conscious of this artificially intelligent entity they've created, reflecting themselves outside of themselves, and they themselves will be gone.
Yeah.
But physical immortality, if you want to be there to consciously appreciate it, is impossible.
Right.
But immortality beyond the physical state, that's the thing.
So really this transhumanism is really sort of a set of physically oriented prosthetics for something awareness and your soul and your consciousness is already able to do if you look at it in that way.
But it's beguiling, and so beguiling that, I mean, people will see, right, let's say a mother has a baby and she's told, well, if you implant this chip into your child, they're going to be more intelligent and have a better memory and be able to do all kinds of things in life, like even musical talent, whatever, and your child will have this advantage. And the mother might think, well, I'm not going to do this because this is awful, I don't want to interfere with my child's body like this is wrong. But then that mother might think, oh God, but what if the other mothers do this? Their children will have an advantage over mine. And then the whole thing escalates, everybody's doing it, and if that's the whole point that Nigel makes, which is the warning that he puts in his books, and he's going to make this very clear in his third book, which will be published in the near future, that if you do interfere with the natural scope of a conscious, aware being with these artificial quantums, then those chips, those interfering elements can be hacked into, can be controlled from outside, mind control, or control, in fact, by these grey alien entities who are masters of technology.
People say that it's a hybridization program, so they're making part human or part alien. Now, how will then that allow them to attain our soul? Can you explain that, John?
Yeah,
What's Nigel saying when he's...
the concept is that the soul, if you like, or the potential part of you is in a continuum outside of atoms and therefore outside of force. But the thing is that while you're within atoms, while you're within a living system, there are symmetries of molecules to do with really shape of water, etc., in which you can actually get these fields, both the physical field and the outside field, which is you, to really resonate, causing this living structure. Well, when that actually parts, when your blood stops flowing and your biomagnetic field slows down... When
you die.
Yeah, when you die, that's no longer held in, and it actually gets out. But it has to get out through increasing or decreasing levels of tension, of force. Now, some of these edges of the force are still, because they're enforced, these greys can actually plug into those little edges. They can't get into the place where, you know, where it goes far enough, the force can't get in there. But they can get you along the edge. And if you have, for instance, have qualities, you know, that are going to bring you back again, then they can actually sort of put little bits at the edge, little sort of nip away at the edge of your soul, if you like, to really to implant qualities that when you come back again, you're a little more like them. And then when that starts to happen, there's you know, that type of part of you is no longer so much under your control, and therefore you tend to keep then coming back as being more and more subject to them, and that's a type of hybridization in a way.
You see, it's their, according to Nigel's thesis, it's their aim through their program to put their program into us. That's their way of. When he talks about riding piggyback on us, that's what it means, putting their program into us so that we become as much like them as possible, and therefore they live on as we live on in their terms. They believe they're living on.
And they do live on, and our bodies do live on, but what is then us is dissolved into a hive mentality.
It's quite a difficult concept. These are quite difficult concepts to grasp, but he has been very brave in putting forward this whole thesis as to why, and he claims that this whole thing explains the UFO phenomenon, why people see UFOs and why they're taken by UFOs.
Yeah, I mean, there is a simpler way to explain it, which he does. He's actually, in some of his interviews, he's spoken about this. He uses the analogy of a text message on a mobile phone. And if a soul, the information of a soul, let's call it a soul field, is like a text message being sent from one phone to another, okay, then that text message can be, the dangers come when that text message can be hacked into and interfered with,
Right.
so that we're no longer in control of our own information field anymore. And we become less and less that perfectly free being we once were before devolution happened.
Right.
We become even more restricted than we would naturally be as physically devolved beings from that perfect state, until we lose our sense of humanity altogether and become, in our psychologies and in our human qualities, very much like machines. And you can really see that that's the way people are going these days. They are becoming more and more like machines. They're living through the internet. They're not communicating with people one-to-one anymore. Everything is becoming virtual. Everything is becoming synthetic.
And just to finish, I mean, Nigel, even in his book, he says that he believes that certain people within the intelligence agencies, and I interviewed a guy called Dan Sherman who backs this up, have either worked with or are aware of the entire Grey Project, and therefore, and it's covered up. So what's are the Greys controlling the hierarchy on this planet through intelligence agencies and the media?
I mean, based on the reports of others, I've got no, personal information to that effect. But it makes sense, how being told such a thing.
So
you think the Greys could have subverted the whole information and power hierarchy of at least
with the intelligence that they have at their disposal, and with what they've done so far, there's no reason to believe they wouldn't do that. They would do everything they possibly can to efficiently and effectively spread their program throughout their human hosts.
Right.
So there's no
and
reason.
And it's clear that it's something about us that they want, because if they, with technology like that, if you wanted the planet, why mess around for 200,000 years?
Okay.
You've got the planet.
And if we can finish on a positive note, is there any light at the end of the tunnel on this? Because it's quite disturbing material if it's true.
Well, as I said, this great teacher, Jesus and the others really said, follow me, and you'll go to the kingdom of heaven. What that really means is here's a blueprint for how to add things back together in life rather than subtract them. Really, to bring yourself back to that origin point.
But how can people do that if they're being abducted against their will? What can people? Is there anything people can do?
Well, interestingly, Nigel says about abductees, he believes that, contrary to what you might expect, that they're people who are most intercepted and most interfered with in this way, that they're actually the ones that they're having trouble intercepting, the ones they're having problems getting through to.
Okay.
And so really it does identify abductees as people who do have quite a lot of hope in that there's something resistant about them to the grey interception process.
And one final comment, I've been discussing this with John, that if ETs are interfering with genetics, I've said to you and others that, well, why can't we get their genomes sequenced and compare them with their parents and then spot any changes in the genes? And basically it's not quite as simple as that, is it, John? It's
not. I mean, the genetics we're talking about is really the whole mechanism of inheritance, etc. DNA is really a part of it. DNA has a certain code based on these four bases, and really to determine whether those four bases have been changed, in individuals, you'd need to know what they were like beforehand. You'd need to test an awful lot of people. But it's far more likely that they're going to mess with the machinery that controls or switches on and off DNA.
John gave me a lesson in epigenetics earlier on today. So
things like epigenetics, these are molecular switching systems which are really then controlled by the coordination of biological water followed by electric fields, which really you've got this hierarchy of effect from your soul field, your quantum field, if you like, really imparting information into the biology through these mechanisms. And therefore, if one wants to look for one particular molecular event, it's not likely you're really going to find it very easily.
Right. All right, chaps and chapesses, thanks very much for talking to me today.
Thanks a lot, Richard.
Go on.
Okay, just one thing, you were talking about what hope is there when it seems a very negative picture. And throughout Nigel's book, as we've mentioned, he refers to the great teachers of the past and what they've suggested to all of us, and the qualities that that to bring people together, to unite, to love and to care, that they always advocated that, not to be selfish, not to be self-centered. Okay. Now, Christ himself, there's several accounts in the Gnostic texts where Christ himself actually warned his apostles about this alien threat. In the second Apocalypse of James, in the Nag Hammadi text, he talks about the pitiless ones and how they will take souls by theft.
Right.
And he warns James of the dangers of all of this. And there's actually another text called the Gospel of Judas, another more recently discovered text, where he actually tells Judas he is of the line, of the seed of an alien entity, and something that is very seems to be something like an abduction or a sighting of a UFO happens. Some kind of craft is described that Judas goes up into.
Okay.
So if he was able to warn his apostles that something was going on here, that there is a serious threat here, that does suggest that he knew something, and in what he suggested and what the other great teachers suggested, maybe there is an antidote to what these grey aliens are doing with interrupting our information field that traces back to the God verse, what Nigel terms the God verse. Maybe we can somehow break those interruptions by, in ourselves, resembling more that prior state where everything was together, where we weren't separate, where we weren't machine-minded.
Okay.
Exactly.
An opposite to transhumanism, very similar to in a near-death experience. People who have near-death experiences, they come back and their lives are transformed. They give people who are previously were businessmen, they give all their money to some charity cause and devote their life to helping people. Countless occasions of this. What those near-death experiences are seeing is the state that he was talking about and the other great teachers were talking about, beyond the atomic state. And their message was, if you focus on that state, you can avoid these terrible threats that are coming at us that we can't do anything about directly.
Even just little phrases in Nigel's book like will and awareness are not part of the physical world. Just little things like that blow my mind apart.
Will is absolute, and if one wills oneself back to this prime state, then you can make it happen.
But generally speaking, they don't want people to know that.
No.
Because then they can't be controlled. But thank you, both of you, for talking to me today. I still don't think I've got my head around it, but
we'll do it again.
Okay. Thanks, Danielle.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you, John.
Thanks, Rich.
It just remains for me to say, believe none of what you hear and only half of what you see. I'm Richard D. Hall. Good night.